Let's talk about authors' intentions. We often talk about an author's intentions when we read. What is it that an author wanted us to get from their book? In fact, it's one of the most common questions I hear both from book clubs and from my own students. But the fact is that an author's intentions only go so far. What really makes reading something interesting is when we create our own reading of the text. So what am I saying? Is it that it doesn't even matter what the author thinks? Not at all. But what I am saying is that your reading of a text doesn't have to end with what the author intended you to get from it. Here's how that works. I really like the way theorist Robert Scholes describes it. He talks about reading as entailing two forces, a centripetal force and a centrifugal force. So centrifugal force we're familiar with from our washing machine, for example. It's the force that pushes the clothes towards the outside of the drum. And when we're reading, the metaphor that Scholes is looking for is that we're moving away from the center of the text. We're looking beyond its intentions towards our own reading that incorporates lots of other things that we have out there in our world that we can bring to our reading of the text. A centripetal reading, one that moves towards the center, is one that pays more attention to what the author intended, to what the author seems to be getting at, so that we're reading both centripetally and centrifugally. We're paying attention to both what we think the author might have intended and what we notice ourselves or what we bring ourselves to a reading of a text. Scholes goes on to say that this is kind of an oversimplification of how reading works, but it's a pretty good metaphor for thinking about how to deal with what an author wanted from us while at the same time paying attention to what the text brings to us and what we bring to the text. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. The novel The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger is a really famous book. A lot of people have read it because it was assigned in high school English class, and it still is assigned in English classes today. But the problem is that the way Salinger thought about his novel is not necessarily the way we still think about his novel because it was written in 1945. So at the time, the voice of Holden Caulfield seemed really fresh and unique and unusual, and that's part of what made such a splash with this publication of this book. That's no longer the case. In fact, we had a really interesting dinner time conversation at my house last winter when my daughter was reading this book in high school and realized that Holden Caulfield, the character, is the same age as her grandparents. So there's a little bit of a disconnect today between the character and students who are the same age as Holden Caulfield is in the novel. It can't be read the same way it was when it was first published, and it can't quite be read the way Salinger wanted it to. So the trick is to recognize what was Salinger getting at, but what are we bringing to it today? And does the novel still have lasting power for us, even though it's an aged novel at this point? So the question that arises, what would authors think of this? Wouldn't they be upset if we're not reading their books the way they intended them to be read? Well, yes, probably some of them would be. Just to give one example, Edgar Allan Poe wrote an entire essay about how he put together the poem The Raven, very instructive for the reader, kind of making sure that they stayed within the guardrails of the poem, what his intention was for the poem. But then there are authors who are quite aware that they're simply writing something and putting it out there in the world for us to do with as we will. So here's what Anton Chekhov wrote in a letter to a friend on that subject. He wrote, "Drawing conclusions is up to the jury, that is, the readers. My only job is to be talented, that is, to know how to distinguish important testimony from unimportant, to place my characters in the proper light and speak their language." In other words, I'll just put it out there and do the best I can to show you the world the way I see it, but it's up to you to do something with that. There's also the problem that authors aren't totally aware of what they're doing. I know for myself as a writer, I'm often working from an intuitive place, Things come together in what I'm writing, not because I've plotted them out carefully, but because one thing leads from another. And the work comes together when you have a good writing day anyway, comes together on its own. I love what Norman Mailer said in response to a high school student's question about symbolism one time. He wrote to the student that generally the best symbols in a novel are those you become aware of only after you finish writing the work. In other words, Mailer didn't plant those symbols in the book. They just kind of instinctively or intuitively showed up. So when we ask about the author's intention, sometimes things look intentional that actually weren't. Think about this the next time that question comes up of the author's intentions, and ask yourself if you're doing what Robert Scholes suggests, both paying attention to what looks like the author's intention, although keeping in mind that it may not have been, and then also incorporating all of the other things that you as an experienced reader can bring to the book that you're reading. Read on!